Hello, welcome back, everybody, to another year of the Sunday Podcast.
I'm Ollie Lam.
And I'm Matt Seddon.
Back in 2025 for our 5th season. You can expect more of this.
He's claiming that he was ill before the semi-final, whatever. But, you know, I just feel like at that point he was just looking for attention.
And some of this.
And you normally say, no human is limited. So I can't limit myself, or I can't just say I can do.
As well as event coverage around all the major races on the UK circuit.
And if you're a fan of the pod, please give us a rating and review on your preferred podcast streaming service.
And if you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, give us a follow on Instagram at Sunday Podcast.
As always, thanks for listening. See you next time. And we hope you enjoyed the episode.
Hello guys, and welcome back to another episode brought to you by sportsshoes.com. As always, Jake Shelley on the podcast today to talk all about his role at the International Testing Agency, the ITA, basically out there trying to catch the bad guys, trying to catch those who are doping. And Jake actually does this in cycling, but he's done some work in athletics before, and also some research for his PhD around doping in athletics, and not too shabby himself as a distance runner with PBs of sub 14 over 5K, sub 30 over 10K as well. So in a great position to chat to us basically about the processes that anti-doping agencies go through and all we kind of want to know around how they're actually going to make sure they keep catching guys over the next few years as well. So enjoy this one as always, and we'll catch you guys very, very soon. Okay, Jake, first off, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for coming on. And just to kick us off, could you tell us a bit about your role?
Thanks for having me on, guys. Yes, I can tell you about my role. I'm currently the testing manager, focusing on the cycling anti-doping program. I've worked for the ITA for like 3.5 years now. For the first 3 or so years, I was a testing officer, focusing on 5 different sports, mostly triathlon. And the testing officer role is deciding who to test, when to test them, whether that's in competition, out of competition, who should be included in the registered testing pool, things like that. And now the manager role is similar. It's just that there are 1,300 cyclists in the RTP. So we have a team of 4 testing officers and 2 testing assistants who do that kind of day-to-day work. And I'm more kind of overseeing that now.
Jesus, what a cool role. You're the guy, probably like us, watching sport, watching these people, and you're basically, just deciding who to pick up on. Your sort of doping spidey senses, if you like, must be pretty good. But how did you, let's just rewind a little bit. How did you get to that point? Because obviously, Oxford grad and a good runner yourself. I've got to say it because I'm not sure you're probably too humble to say it, but 2015 is no joke. It's a very good time and you should be very proud of that. So start from, your career and how you end up in this role.
Thanks, Matt. That's very kind. Yeah, I do like my job a lot. And but it's kind of a long story how I got there. I guess even from like the early days, I think I was lucky that my dad was really, really into all sports. He's a Fulham season ticket holder, but he also loves endurance sports. He's done 10 marathons, and he reads a lot. And there were tons of like sports books always around our house. So I think in like 2004, 5 maybe, when I was 13, 14, I read Lance Armstrong's autobiographies, quickly followed by Paul Kimmage's book, Rough Ride. Paul Kimmage is like a journalist who went after some of the doping cyclists in the early 2000s and stuff. And reading those 2 books like back to back, you just realize that the first one was something weird was going on. And I found that really interesting. I was like, this guy's clearly doping, but people think he's a hero, and everyone was wearing the yellow Live Strong bands, all that kind of stuff. At the same time, I was running decently myself at that time, English schools, track, stuff like that. I started getting physiotherapy treatment from a triple jumper called Tricia Smith, who kind of trained at Shaftesbury Barnet, and she was the world champion in 2005 in kind of an event that was really impacted by doping again. In that time period, Tatiana Lebedeva from Russia won the Olympics in 2004, I think. And I think her career was basically affected quite a lot by doping. And when she was giving me physio treatment, she would just talk about that and how her life had kind of been changed by doping. So even from back in those, I was really interested. And then, like you said, I went to Oxford and I did biochemistry. I found a lot of the degree really hard and some of it quite boring, but some of the stuff I found interesting was the kind of cross-section with sport and like doping. So that my favorite lectures of the whole course, the whole 4-year course, were the lectures delivered by Professor Kieran Clark, who developed ketones. She was the first person to synthesize ketones in a way that could be absorbed by the human body. This was already in like 2010, 11, something like that. And she was saying that she was giving them to British Cycling and Team Sky and stuff like that back in the day.
Wow.
I thought that stuff was really, really interesting. And I started writing a blog, again back in 2011, something like that, about doping in sport. So I was always interested in it from that perspective, but it wasn't working, obviously. And then I went to America to do the athletic scholarship thing and did a master's in exercise physiology, which again was kind of related. We learned how to draw blood and measure each other's hematocrit, which I also found interesting in relation to the fact that there used to be that rule that if your hematocrit was over 50, then you couldn't start a race, because I thought it might be indicative of doping, but it's quite a crude measure. And like when I measured my hematocrit, it was 49. I was like, well, I know I'm not doping, and like it's pretty close. It's all through that I was still very interested in it as a fan and a kind of scientist. And I came back to the UK after that and wanted to do a PhD looking at the methods of anti-doping and how to make them better, because I think I've always thought that the actual lab methods could be improved. It's really hard to find a funded PhD in that specific area, because a lot of the kind of biochemistry PhDs are funded from big medical grants and they focus on medical stuff. So I ended up doing a PhD more on the social science of doping and trying to understand why people dope, or what the experience of being a clean athlete is in a doping environment or a sport where there's lots of doping. So it was a real pivot, and it was looking at psychology and sociology. And again, I found it quite difficult, but in the end, very rewarding, interviewing loads of top level athletes about what it's like to submit whereabouts in atoms for 15 years every single day, this type of thing. And also speaking to some athletes who'd used EPO, just hearing their perspective, and then speaking to some agents about the doping issue in Kenya and the kind of causes of that. And then after that, I applied for this job at the ITA and got the testing officer job first, which I loved. And then the manager position opened up, and now I'm doing that. Sorry, long story, but yeah, it goes back a while for me.
No, that's brilliant, Jake. Thanks so much. And I think that'll be really helpful for the listeners going forward as well. But look, we of course want to chat to you about, I guess, a lot of the key topics, if you like, or key trends within distance running surrounding doping. And hopefully you can give us your expertise around some of those. Just to, I guess, start with as well. So you work for the ITA. There is, I guess, one thing that must frustrate fans, and for Matt and myself as well, is the amount of organizations working within doping. And it seems they're all doing lots of different things, and it's really hard to work out who's doing what and how they're working together. So we've obviously got like WADA, the AIU, things like that. So what are the key bodies out there, and how are they kind of working alongside each other?
Yeah, it's kind of a shame that there are so many acronyms, and a lot of the stuff's really inaccessible to athletes, the people that actually impact, or even just fans. Like, it's quite hard to understand and quite complex. I'll try to summarize it briefly. So WADA, it's best to think of them as the global regulator. They set the rules, decide what's banned and what isn't banned, and also monitor the compliance of the laboratories, make sure that the labs are detecting the doping substances in an efficient way. And also they check the compliance of us, which are the bodies actually implementing the testing. So they make sure that, we're following all of the regulations about how testing should be done, but they don't actually do any testing. So WADA are not the people deciding, should we test this athlete or this athlete? Should we go this week or next week? Should we do a blood sample or a urine sample? Those decisions are made by primarily one of two organizations, which is the National Anti-Doping Organization or the International Organization. So in Britain, that's UCAD. And if you're an athlete, the international organization is the AIU. So if you're a British elite athlete, you could be tested by UCAD or the AIU. But if you're a British elite swimmer, you could be tested by UCAD or World Aquatics. And here's where the ITA comes in, is that many of the international sporting federations, like World Aquatics, the UCI for cycling, World Triathlon, have delegated that part of their anti-doping program to the ITA. So whereas athletics does it themselves with their own body called the AIU, almost all other Summer Olympic sports have delegated that responsibility to the ITA. So it's wrestling, it's weightlifting, it's volleyball, it's handball, it's field hockey, it's triathlon, it's orienteering, cycling, swimming. And so that's what we do here is across all countries, working together with the NADO, saying, well, if you're going to test him, then we'll test somebody else. So there's a balance between the national organization and the international organization. And yeah, WADA just kind of sits above and makes sure that we're doing our job properly by auditing us and stuff like that.
Why do you think athletics has its own, I guess, organization? The ARU you mentioned who are testing
I think
instead of using you guys like the other sports.
Yeah. So the ARU was born out of some of the scandals around Russia and even the scandal around Lamine Diak, because he's the president of the World Athletics before Seb Coe, and he was involved in taking bribes and stuff to cover up Russian doping. So that actually predates the ITA is not a very old company, and those scandals were a bit before the ITA existed. So maybe if the ITA were a bit older, they would have had that option there to delegate to us as an independent body. But maybe at that time we weren't developed enough. So they said, well, we need to do something ourselves at this moment. And I think Seb Coe, that was one of his has been one of his big projects, to set up the ITA with a good governance structure, meaning that they're well funded but also independent. So I think that's why.
Right, I see. And so you're then in communication with these national anti-doping bodies, and what makes you want to test someone, especially I think out of competition?
The first decision we have to make is who should be included in our registered testing pool, because those are the athletes who we test out of competition, because they're the ones who give us whereabouts information. So if I wanted to test one of you guys, for instance, it'd be quite difficult to locate you because you're not in Adams. You don't submit the whereabouts information. But at the start of each year, we decide, well, for cycling, it's about 1,300 riders who are in our registered testing pool, and those guys have to submit whereabouts in Adams. And the process of deciding who we should include, it varies a bit sport by sport. For cycling, because of the history, there's a blanket rule that any rider on a World Tour team or a Pro Tour team is automatically included in the registered testing pool on the men's side. Whereas on the women's side, where we don't quite have the same history, we do a risk assessment. So we say, right, these are the 360 professional women's road riders. Some of them are already being tested by the national bodies. Some of them are performing really well, have never been tested. And then just make a decision with the budget that we have, which 100 female road riders we think should be included in our pool. And then the smaller decisions about when they should be tested or how we use the resources we have to spread the testing come later. But first of all, we have to decide who to test.
Just picking up on, I guess, what you mentioned there about the funding you have available, because I think everyone would I guess love to see you test absolutely everyone and have everyone on the whereabouts. But who's actually funding these organizations and who's funding like the ITA, for example?
That's actually a really important point, and the thing that I like best now about working on the cycling program, because the cycling anti-doping program is funded in quite a unique way, which is that all of the stakeholders provide money towards anti-doping, whether that's the teams, the race organizers, the riders themselves, and the UCI. And they contribute like a large amount. So in order to register as a World Tour men's team, you have to provide a large amount of money per year, which is dedicated towards anti-doping. Whereas when I was working on triathlon, the only money that we would get was from World Triathlon. There was no contribution from the triathletes or from the races. I mean, that's a lie. The races paid for the testing done at their race in triathlon, but they didn't contribute to out of competition testing, which we think is the more valuable type of testing, because most people are not going to arrive at a race with drugs in their system. So yeah, cycling set up this really nice structure where all of the stakeholders see the value of anti-doping and contributed to it financially. ARU for athletics is trying to do something a bit similar. They get some contributions from World Marathon Majors and some of the brands. I think Nike, Asics, maybe one other that I'm forgetting, contribute to the ARU's program. And I think that's kind of the way to go, is say who's benefiting financially from the sport, and therefore who should benefit or who should contribute towards anti-doping. Cycling does that really well, and it means we can have this extensive program with a large testing pool and a high number of out-of-competition tests.
Jake, I'm sure you know a lot of drugs and what they do, how they enhance athletes. You mentioned there about, the out-of-competition testing being the key part, really. Does it worry you how quickly some performance-enhancing drugs can get out of athlete systems? Like, what are we working with? Because I think we just assume that if someone's doping, the likelihood of them being caught is quite high. But is that the case?
Yeah. Some drugs definitely clear the system very quickly. And we're constantly doing things to try to get over that hurdle, let's say, whether it's methods which have a longer detection window or surprising athletes with when we show up to test them. There's even like different types of sample that you can collect. It's not just urine and blood anymore. We can also collect dried blood spots, which is like is a kind of better for the athletes because it's less invasive. It's just like almost like a lactate test. It's like you just need a drop of blood, put it on a card. But the point is that once it's on the card, there's no enzymatic activity. Like the sample is frozen in that state. Whereas if you ship whole blood, it can actually deteriorate in transit to the lab. And so we try to like at least make it so that when we take the sample out of the athlete, nothing else is deteriorating en route, and there's no further like the detection window doesn't increase in the time it takes the sample to get from collection to analysis in the lab. So yeah, I mean, yes, it's an issue. Short detection windows are a serious issue, and we're doing as much as we can to minimize the impact of that.
You mentioned your role is obviously within cycling, but I presume there's very similar in athletics, right? But is to, I guess, decide who you go after and when you test them and those sorts of things. You mentioned that your PhD was kind of a bit more psychological, a bit more sociological to what you'd like done previously in doping. Are you taking those sorts of things into account when you decide who to test and where to test them? Is it almost a bit of strategy on your part to kind of decide, okay, where are we going to go test this guy or girl, and who fits the profile psychologically, perhaps, or are you looking at other factors other than, I guess, stats in terms of how quick Mokatir improves, for example? Over.
Yeah, we definitely are looking at more than just that. We also have an intelligence and investigations team, which helps with some inputs about who they recommend that we test at various times. And I think one of the big things that feeds into that is obviously like associations, who these people are connected with and how we think that might influence their risk of doping. And that would be the same for cycling as it is for athletics. Training partners, coaches, teams, doctors, all of that stuff would feed into it. In terms of like the psychological profile, we do look at it a bit, and it can get quite speculative, but we try to use everything we have available to our advantage, and it's not all a very exact science. But yeah, we have enough tests where we can take a few punts, and then once you do that, you get stuff like an unsuccessful attempt where we go to where a rider says they're going to be, and they're not there. And then that in itself is like another interesting piece of information. Like, why were they not there? So it kind of builds up over time, and you develop a kind of picture or a feeling for how risky a certain person might be.
On the individuals, obviously a large part of your job is catching individuals who are doping. But do you ever, as an organization, I mean, for example, obviously we see so many Kenyans dope, and I just always think back, they often have the same association with certain agents.
Yeah.
Is there ever a point where you're like, right, should we go after the supplier? Like, where are these athletes getting their drugs from? Who gave them to them? When did they take them? Like that sort of thing. Do you ever do that? Or do you have to, I don't know if there's like the laws and whatnot, you just have to focus purely on capturing individuals?
No, 100%. We're trying to break up the system behind it. And I think that we're starting to get in place what we would actually need to do that. Because if you think about it, like if you just catch someone with drugs in the system and just ban them, it never quite gets there. But what we have now, which is kind of quite a new thing, is these written into some of the anti-doping rules, or some of the sports anti-doping rules. So cycling, athletics, some other high-risk sports have put in this clause which gives us enhanced investigative powers if we have a positive test. So if we collect a sample, the lab analyze it and say it's positive for EPO, at the moment when we go and tell the rider, you're notified for a positive test, we can also seize devices and look on the devices for where they may have purchased the EPO, who may have helped them. And that's not something that we've been doing for very long, or even that So that's something that we hope will allow us to break up the system behind it, whether that's us or the AIU and athletics. And then even looking bigger than that is like trying to investigate the supply chains, because EPO is a medical drug that's produced by pharmaceutical companies for the purposes of helping people with diseases such as kidney failure, so they have enough red blood cells. And there's a gap here between the drug being produced by the pharmaceutical companies and getting to the patients who need it. Some's clearly leaking out. And so we're trying to investigate where and how the drugs are getting out of the medical supply chain, because EPOs really, synthetic EPOs, you need a lot of infrastructure to be able to synthesize that. It's not something you can cook up in your basement with a few chemicals. Like, you need serious biochemical equipment, and there are only certain companies which actually produce it. So trying to figure out where and how it's leaking out of the supply chain is another area of investigation on our side.
Mm. Is it right that there's, I guess, still places in the world where these things are available, like over the counter, or is that kind of no longer the case and a bit of a, I guess, a bit of a rumor mill?
I think, unfortunately, it's probably the case in certain parts of the world.
Yeah.
And again, that plays into it. Like, when we identify a country or a location where you can purchase something like EPO very easily, we try to test athletes when they're in those locations. We try to ask the question, why are they going to those locations? And rather than just testing them when it's like cheapest or most convenient, or where we have a doping control officer who can do it, actually spending the extra money to say, right, fly to, wherever it is and test the athlete when they're there.
Do you get tip-offs? And what do you regard as like a genuine tip-off, like good intel, for example, and someone who might know something? I believe there are such things as like incident reports.
Yeah.
And you can fill in, I think, a few forms online, like on WADA and stuff like that.
Yeah.
How seriously do you take them?
We do get tip-offs, and we take them more or less seriously depending on certain contextual aspects. Mm-hmm. If it's completely anonymous and doesn't give us the opportunity to respond, then there's only so much value you can place on it, especially if there's just a statement without a supporting fact. Right. Whereas our tip-off system, if you like, allows our intelligence and investigations team to respond, even if the person retains their anonymity. There's a secure platform. And then our investigators can ask certain questions which might help them to verify some of the information that's being provided with stuff that we already have or other reports that we've received. But honestly, the ones that probably have the most value are the ones where the informant waives their right to anonymity. So then our investigators can talk to them, know who they are, understand why they might be able to know this stuff, and then, assess the information with the full context. But obviously there are certain occasions when an informant might have a very valid reason for not wanting to waive their right to anonymity. But we have all kind of different levels. And I think the point that some athletes maybe don't see is that everybody hears rumors, or every athlete has quite a sensitive radar for who might be doping. But they tend not to report that because they think, but this is just a feeling. It's just something I heard. I don't have concrete evidence. But I always try to encourage even those athletes to report those feelings, because they're so in tune with what is and isn't possible in their sport, and what's a normal or an abnormal behavior or training routine or association. And what they don't know is that what we see on our side could add to that picture. So if they just have a random feeling or rumor or perception based on their experience, and they tell us, we can add to that the fact that that person may have had 2 missed tests, or the fact that they may have had a blood passport value which is really high or unusual. And so what might seem insignificant to them, when added to the context that we already have, can then become really significant. So I would always encourage athletes, even if you don't have evidence, there still can be value in reporting your perceptions.
Because there's no negatives really for them, sort of filling out the incident report online.
No, I mean, some athletes are concerned that it might unfairly influence our testing program, but it is not the case that if we receive a report the next day, we're going to go and follow that anonymous report and just change our whole plan. But we'll assess it and compare it to what we already know, and then make a plan based on that.
And I guess there's also nothing wrong with you having a hunch and going and chasing it up, and then actually they turn out clean, right? That's still, in a way, just as good as catching someone.
I think so, yeah. And I think the clean athletes welcome it. They say, well, I've got absolutely nothing to hide. Test me as much as you want because I know that I'm clean, and then we'll adjust our perspective if they keep coming back clean. So, yeah. You
mentioned the blood passports then, and this is something I've kind of wandered for a while, and correct me if I'm way off on the science here, but say an athlete who, they started blood doping, whatever it is, at a super young age, before they are able to kind of have a blood passport or one is needed. How hard would it be to, I guess, prove that they're continuing to dope if they're kind of, it appears like their natural levels are low, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what we particularly look for, though, are unusual variations within one athlete's profile. So it's not so much that the levels would be consistently high or consistently unusual, it's that the variations within it would be unusual. So I think regardless of when you started doping, each time you took EPO or each time you withdrew blood or infused blood, there would be this really unusual like variation.
Right.
So I don't think it matters so much when the person starts doping, but how well we can target the testing either, right after one of those methods is used.
That requires probably quite a lot of out of competition testing, though. I mean, a world-class athlete, how many times are they getting tested per year?
So in cycling, the athletes in our registered testing pool have between 3 and 12 out of competition tests assigned to them, depending on their particular risk level. The minimum is 3 for an athlete in a registered testing pool. Like, that's another wider rule. As the global regulator, they say that if you're going to require an athlete to provide whereabouts information 365 days a year, they should be tested at least 3 times out of competition, because it's not really fair to ask that from an athlete and then never use the information, never go and test them. So the rule is a minimum of 3 out of competition tests per year per RTP, per registered testing pool athlete. Sorry, I keep slipping into acronyms.
With that, what is your most successful, I guess, strategy? Is it randomly catching someone in an out of competition test? Is it at a race? Is it someone where you've built up a big profile and then you go and target them? Is it a tip off?
I think it's the well targeted tests which combine information coming from intelligence investigations, information coming from the passport, information coming from performance, or like locations, like I was saying, like suspicious locations. Those really well targeted tests seem to be the ones which have the best success. So we set up our team and our organization to try to have access to all of the relevant information so they can do that targeting for 5,000 out of competition tests per year, which is a lot of work. So yeah, we need the guys to have the tools to be able to make those decisions in an informed way.
I'm imagining like a CSI type room at work with athletes' faces on the walls, and is there anything like that?
Well, we have really smart people working. We have a really good data analytics team, guys who are able to help us see all of the information that could feed into it in a user-friendly way. So I don't know. We'll do our best, let's say.
Yeah. Jesus, it must feel good when you finally nail these idiots. Yeah, I was going to use a worse word, but I want to talk about TUEs. And are they public knowledge? Do athletes know what other athletes TUEs have and that sort of thing? And how many, I guess, TUEs can an athlete have? Is there a limit on it?
So generally speaking, the specifics of the TUEs are not public knowledge. What we publish is how many TUEs have been granted per year for cycling.
Right.
And it's quite a low number. It's like something between.
Do you think they should be public knowledge?
Well, probably not. Like, I can understand why, but then on the flip side, there's really sensitive stuff there. Like, like certain fertility drugs are prohibited. So then would you want a female athlete who's having fertility issues to have to make that public knowledge? Stuff like that. And I understand why, particularly if there's like TUEs for asthma medications or other things that we might consider grey area, then maybe it would help to have that be mandatorily made public, because people would be less willing to kind of do it if it was going to be exposed. But on the flip side, there are genuine reasons why some athletes have to take substances which are prohibited for a real medical purpose that they might not want the whole world to know about. So that's kind of the tricky balance.
With that, and I guess that is the point, right? Is that the whole point of a therapeutic use exemption is that you need it regardless of if you're competing or not. How, and you might not be able to answer this, how easy is it to get a TUE that's a bit grey? Because you hear loads of stories, right? And you hear stories of athletes having 20 TUEs, and some are for vitamin D, and they're training in Ethiopia at the time. So it's kind of like...
Yeah, it's definitely more well regulated than it used to be. So there's a proper process, right, where a doctor has to submit quite extensive documentation, which is then reviewed by a TUE committee. And some of them are declined. Some of them say, well, that's, you could take this alternative medication which would have the same effect, but wouldn't enhance your performance potentially. So I think there's a pretty good process in place now. I won't say there's no occasions where we're like, it's hard to say whether or not that's enhancing performance or whether that's for a genuine medical need. It's hard to completely remove the grey area, I think. But there's a thorough process in place. And what we see from that is that the number of TUEs have gone down in like the last 10 years. They've gone down quite dramatically from 10 or 15 years ago to what's now been a stable level for the past 5 or 6 years within cycling, which we hope reflects the stable level of people who actually need them.
That's encouraging. On cycling and your professional opinion, I'm sure you've got your ear to the ground when it comes to distance running as well. But compare the two sports. Cycling has always been way worse off, especially when it comes to media and the scandals involved in doping. But is cycling actually in a really good place now? Like, are there very few busts? I'm not too in tune with what goes on in the cycle world. Compare that to running.
So at the top level of men's road cycling, there are relatively few positive cases, but there is still a steady number of positive cases at a slightly lower level. So there's still definitely doping going on. But you're right that it's not creating the same stir recently as like the high level Kenyan athletes in athletics that are being caught for doping. So yeah, hard to make a genuine assessment about whether that's because maybe the doping methods are a bit less sophisticated at the top level of distance running compared to the top level of cycling, or what could be behind that. A bit of a tricky one.
That's a fair point. And, on Kenya and their doping, do you believe nations, are you for nations being banned? When is enough? Or do you see it as, you obviously looked into that sociological background, and would that be unfair?
Well, I think the reason why Russia was banned as a nation for doping is because they could prove the role that the Russian state was playing in that doping, hiding positive tests with a state-funded laboratory. Whereas I don't think we currently have the evidence that there's any involvement of Athletics Kenya or any governmental organization in the doping of Kenyan athletes. It seems to be more, if anything, via the agents or other kind of private parties that seem to be facilitating the doping. So that's the difference, and why one resulted in a blanket ban of all athletes from that country and the other just seems to have a lot of individual cases.
Yeah.
I mean, I did get to work on anti-doping for athletics during the Olympic Games because the Olympic Games delegates their anti-doping program to the ITA. So for that 4-week period, it was my job to say, well, which distance runners should we test 2 weeks before the Olympic Games?
Yep.
So for me, that was obviously a dream role.
I can imagine.
And what I can say is that then when we had access to the data and saw the testing that AIU had been doing and the national anti-doping organizations in the lead up to the Olympics, the guys qualified for the Olympics were tested very extensively in the lead up. And we tried to top that up by doing some targeted testing in that final preparation period. But I didn't look at that and be, God, there's huge holes everywhere. Why has this guy not been tested for 6 months? That wasn't the feeling I got looking at that.
Yeah. With the Kenyans then, obviously it's kind of a massive issue at the moment, but do you think more Kenyans are doping than in other nations, or are they, I guess, more susceptible to testing in that they're getting tested more because there's more suspicion, or they're just not covering their tracks as well as maybe, say, Brits, for example, who as British fans, we tend to presume are squeaky clean, right? I think that's fair to say that's the media view on it a lot of the time.
I think it's a little bit of maybe all three. I think clearly the prevalence of doping is a bit higher. They're also really well tested nowadays, thoroughly tested by the AIU. And I think in British sport, we know the culture of British distance running quite well at a club level, 3, I guess. Mm-hmm. And I think that we would recognise that there is quite a strong culture of clean sport at our level. I mean, yeah, like Matt, your brother's been to the Olympics, right? But I imagine that from the way he was raised through the club scene, that it just wouldn't have even occurred to him that was an option. And I think that has quite a strong influence. And I don't think that culture necessarily exists in the same way elsewhere.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Something I also want to ask you about, Jake, is if an athlete retires, let's say they were doping throughout their career, once they retire, is that it? Because you do see cases where, especially like that 2012 Olympics, we there was someone not too long ago who, who got found out they were doping, and they were long retired. So
Yeah.
I'm baffled how you can still catch people well beyond their retirement and their competing days.
Yeah. So it's definitely not it, because each year for cycling, we put around between 1 and 2,000 of all of the samples we collect into long-term storage. So they get deep frozen, basically.
Right.
And then we'll leave them there for up to 10 years.
Yep.
And then when something new comes along, say we get a new piece of intel saying that group were doping, we'll go and unfreeze all of the samples that we have in all of the laboratories around the world and reanalyze them with the latest methods, because it could also happen that the methods get a bit better, more sensitive, and then we'll try again. We will have already analyzed the sample once, taken a small amount of it, analyzed it, put the rest into deep freeze. But as the methods advance, or as we get more information, then we can do that. So it's a big decision for us each year which samples of all of the ones we collected should we store, because we can't store all of them, unfortunately.
Is that alarming to you that, you almost put them in storage for 10 years, and then in that time you hope that your technology is advanced and the methods have advanced, that you can detect a drug that someone was using 10 years ago?
It's maybe alarming, but it's better than just leaving it undetected
It is
forever.
definitely. But that's crazy to put that into context.
I guess similarly then, not with retired athletes, but with athletes who are on bans, how often are they getting tested, or are they even getting tested? Take Shelby Houlihan as one athlete who perhaps people thought she might never return again. She's returned and she's back right at the top level. Okay. For her 4-year ban, what does that look like? Is she still classed as an elite athlete with whereabouts and all those things?
It's sort of, to some extent, at the discretion of the anti-doping organization. So, because you have to make an assessment, like, where are the resources best spent? Are they best spent on an athlete who we know will not be competing for 4 years, but who we think is clearly risky for doping because they've already been caught for doping? Or should we maybe not test them for the first couple of years of their ban and then start testing them again in the last couple of years of their ban? Or was their doping so egregious that we should be testing them every month for the entire 4 years of the ban, regardless of how much the resources involved in that would be? So generally they are tested. Some of them are tested more towards the end of the ban. Some have been tested for the entirety of their ban. And it's left up to each testing team to make that decision.
You work in cycling, so you must see athletes receive huge, there's huge financial incentive in cycling, more so than running. Do you believe in bans?
I mean, it's a really tricky question, because there's kind of, unfortunately, always a chance of a false positive, which is a really tricky one, because obviously I've kind of at this point dedicated quite a large part of my life towards anti-doping, and like you say, when we get a positive, it's so rewarding, and it's so gratifying. Then we just want that to be it. We've caught them. We've invested all these resources. We've finally done the test at the right moment, sent it to the right lab, done the right analysis, and it's positive. That should be it. The person should be gone. But the methods do not have 100% hit rate of saying this sample has EPO in it and this one does not. I mean, there's the Peter Boll case, which is an example of that, where if you really look at the detail of the method for detecting EPO, it's really, really hard to tell what is EPO that my body has produced naturally because I've been to altitude or because I've been doing training, and what is EPO that's synthetic and that's been injected into me. And you do not have 100% success rate of distinguishing between the two. So that would be my only...
Yeah. It's very difficult to hand out lifetime bans on that.
Is that still the hardest to detect then? And I guess the most popular for endurance athletes, the blood doping or EPO use?
Yeah, I mean, EPO is tricky and it's hard, but also difficult is to detect blood transfusions when an athlete takes out their own blood, stores it, and then reinfuses their own blood. Because as you can imagine, to find someone's own blood within themselves and tell that it's blood that's been reinfused is hard. There are ways of doing it, but it's not.
Absolutely. And Jay, just before we finish up then, what are you kind of, I guess, finish on some good news, what are you kind of feeling really good about in terms of athletics and then doping in general, in terms of like the past 12 months or what's coming up next for I guess, clean sport? Like what should we be really excited about in terms of testing or measures that are in place?
I think that intuitively, or like, again, taking a step away from my professional role and just as a fan of the sport, the guys that I interviewed were mostly competing for my PhD in the Olympics between like 2008, 2012. And I think that most people who watched Paris and compared it to maybe 2008, 2012 would just look at the results and have a better feeling about them. The kind of spread of countries doing well is broader. And the fact of it is that the athletes are better tested. They're just more tested in the build-up. We're not getting as many random athletes coming out of high-risk countries performing at a crazy level, particularly in Olympic year. Still a few, but I think there are fewer. And so on my optimistic side, I feel that now in these sports, clean athletes at least have the chance to win, whereas maybe they didn't in the past. When I plan a test, I have to have a completely pessimistic hat on and say, right, each time I plan a test, I have to imagine that that person is doping and then decide when I think they're most likely to be doping. But outside of that, when I'm watching athletics, I do think that like we're seeing clean athletes win global titles, and so it can be done. So I have to balance those two.
Yeah, no, that's good. Do you think Paris was one of the cleanest games ever? Was it a big success?
I'm hesitating there because people said that about 2012, didn't they? The testing program was the most thorough that we've ever had.
Yeah, Jesus.
And then all of that long-term storage reanalysis stuff turned out a load of positives. But we ran as good of a program as we could with the methods that are currently available, and I think we did what we could with the tools that we have.
How much has testing and methods advanced? Because you talk about 08, 2012, just being, a good while ago now, and people watching it and being a little bit skeptical. But what about in the 90s? What about in the 80s? Because on the track, there are times that that have been run, and as fast as we're running, and the shoe technology and the tracks and everything like this, but the men's 1500 world record still hasn't been beaten. The men's 800, I know Rhodesia in 2012 ran exceptionally well, but there were people running 141, 142 20 years prior to Rhodesia. So do you look back at those eras, and are you skeptical of those eras, the 80s, the 90s?
The methods are continually evolving and they're continually getting better. That's true. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I discredit every performance that was done when the methods were not as good.
Right.
Because the other thing to bear in mind is that methods for doping have evolved. Like EPO wasn't always available in a synthetic form. Like it just wasn't like that was only a possibility from 94, 95 onwards. And then, I don't know, I was coached for a bit by Alan Story, who was involved with Kim McDonald, who was involved with Daniel Komen. Some of the stuff that Alan told me about Daniel Komen just leads me to believe that there's a pretty good chance that he wasn't doping. He had 720 in the 90s. That's all obviously completely that's not scientific. Someone that I trusting another person and me putting some weight on that. So it's not evidence, but yeah, I don't discredit all performances from back in the 90s by any stretch.
It's good to hear, and I think a great place to end, because I think if someone who's seen as much as you can still watch athletics and enjoy it, then I think we all can, which is good to hear. But Jake, thanks so much for chatting to us today. It's been brilliant.
Thanks for having me on, guys. Cheers.